speaks. So Lawrence Buell, or Larry Buell, who is our first speaker and starts off the conference, is the Powell M. Cabot Professor of American Literature here at Harvard, and he is a world-renowned scholar of New England literary culture and American nature writing. His books, The Environmental Imagination and Writing for an Endangered World, are a must-read for anyone who's interested in American literature and the environment. So it's a great pleasure to introduce Larry to you, and please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you, Don. Thank you, Dan. As one of the two Harvard humanists who's longest been associated with the Interfaculty Environment Initiative, I'm delighted to be on hand at this, the first really substantial event in environmental humanities that the Center has sponsored, for which thanks to Dan, and at the strong revival of interest in environmental studies within the Divinity School that I remember having flourished before in the Tucker era, if I may call it that. What I'm going to give today is about two-thirds short position statement, I hope provocative enough, one-third application to a, I hope, familiar text, centering on an ethical issue with which folks in my bailiwick of eco-criticism, whether they know it or not, are being forced to wrestle with these days, both from internally generated pressures and pressures from without. So, what, if anything, can literature and the other arts and scholars of them really bring to the table in a time of environmental crisis? This is a question I'm often asked, both within the academy as well as outside, and I think understandably. At most universities, Harvard included, most who study, teach, and write about the environment are scientists, engineers, economists, lawyers, medical researchers, public policy specialists. Eco-critics, environmental humanists generally, still by contrast few, although our ranks are growing at Harvard and the Department of History especially, but elsewhere too. Well, I have a ready first stage answer, namely that the arts of imagination have a far more important role to play than the questioner's usually needling tone implies. Now, how do you turn a swamp into a wetland? Huh? The transition from the bygone era of promiscuous swamp draining to the contemporary age of comparative wetlands protection hasn't just happened through scientific expertise or through litigation alone, crucial though they are. It also takes a broader transformation of public values and commitments, to which end the arts of language and imaging are indispensable, starting with the transformation of that key signifier, benign wetland versus pejorative swamp. Of all those strongly opposed to Alaska North Slope drilling, how many are moved mainly by media images of northern Alaska as the nation's last truly pristine tract of wilderness? Surely many more than those who have actually been there or who have laboriously studied the arguments pro and con with the eye of expertise. The Rachel Carson of contemporary social theory, Ulrich Beck, that's my label for him, rightly declares that only if nature is brought into people's everyday images, into the stories they tell, can its beauty and its suffering be seen and focused on. That the success of all environmental initiatives finally hinges not on some highly developed technology or some arcane new science, but on a state of mind that's bound to be shaped as much or more by the power of images, narratives, metaphors, as by appeals to data, expertise, and formal reasoning. So small wonder that advocates for the sport hunting industry used to complain that the worst thing that had ever happened to it was Bambi. Small wonder that it was Carson's silent spring that triggered 60s activism around pesticides and environmental pollution, rather than the two other contemporaneous, also hard-hitting books on the same issue, Murray Bookchin's Our Synthetic Environment and Robert Rudd's Pesticides in the Living Landscape, sometimes called Silent Spring for professors. The difference lay not just in Carson's better networking into the publishing industry, which he had, serialization in the New Yorker and so forth, but in her far better eye for the telling story and the unforgettable image. In short, her literary edge as an award-winning nature writer. So there's a strong prima facie case for the value-changing potential of environmental aesthetics. Let that be said. But the case, as just framed, is also incomplete and question-begging. Grant that there have been causal links between certain acts of environmental imagination and individual life practice and or public policy. Henry Thoreau's inspiration for modern environmentalists and Back to the Landers. Upton Sinclair's novelistic expose of the Chicago meatpacking industry. The Jungle. Carson's Silent Spring. Grant that future acts of imagination in text, film, and other media will have similar impact. However true and important this be, and it is, if that's the one thing that we can say about the significance of environmental art and criticism, we reduce art to instrumentalism and scholars to cheerleading chroniclers of a few exceptional cases. This whole subject of art's use value has always been hard for either artists or critics to discuss without falling into hypocrisy and self-contradiction. How many a man has dated a new era in his life from the reading of a book, declares Henry Thoreau in Walden, obviously hoping that his book will have such an impact too. On the other hand, elsewhere, he no less categorically insists, if I knew for a certainty that a man was coming to my house with a conscious intention of doing me good, I should run for my life. Well, somebody capable of thinking like that would have felt a little ambivalent about seeing his masterpiece turned into a poster child for environmental advocacy, not so? As with poets, so with critics. Never more than now, when there's so strong a push within academe across the board to want to coordinate, if not positively conjoin the roles of scholarly investigator and public intellectual. And that's a confession as well as a diagnosis. In the bailiwick of eco-criticism, the two most salient ways in which we see this being done and urged right now, often intertwined, are first, environmental justice revisionism, from which standpoint literary scholarship and activist efforts on behalf of immiserated communities ought to go hand in hand. And second, so-called narrative scholarship, that is, transfusing critical reflection with autobiographical narrative, such as to give what otherwise might seem detached scholarly analysis greater immediacy and point, by inflecting it with a kind of personal witness that dramatizes further the claims of some form of eco-stewardship. Both these initiatives have produced some valuable results. I myself have publicly supported both, and I meant what I said. They can also take a good thing too far. It ought, for instance, to be possible to think of art and scholarship as seriously engaged with issues of social and planetary import without imposing a yardstick of manifest impact, historically or in the now. For one thing, worthily eloquent voices may be ignored. For another, influence is notoriously hard to pin down. For another, even when it can be, it may differ drastically from what was meant or what an attentive student would think warranted. Sinclair's The Jungle is a famous case in point. It drew the immediate attention of President Teddy Roosevelt, who dispatched a Blue Ribbon Commission to Chicago, as a result of which, within 6 months of publication, both the Pure Food and Drug Act and Beef Inspection Act were passed. Not bad, you might say. But this wasn't, however, the reform that the author had been hoping for. I aimed at the public's heart, and by accident I hit it in the stomach, was his complaint. His aim, clear enough from the book, was to, reading the book, was to write the Uncle Tom's Cabin of wage slavery, as his friend Jack London put it. But the upshot wasn't to activate sympathy for worker plight so much as consumerist fears of tainted food. When Sinclair in old age was invited to the White House by LBJ to witness the signing of a new, stiffer meat inspection law, his sense of irony must have been rather great. But the prior and more basic problem with impact-oriented thinking, carried beyond a point, is the presumption that environmental writing and/or criticism is or ought to be conceived as service to cause versus as, say, upshot of polymorphous intellectual curiosity, or diffuse concern for environmentality, not associated with any settled position. At the birth of the ego-critical insurgency in the early 90s, a strong activist and normative impetus was necessary, more necessary at any rate, in order to make a forceful debut, as with, say, first-wave race and feminist and sexuality studies. But programmaticism of whatever stamp soon becomes more constraint than enabler. In a cross-disciplinary forum on religion, values, and the environment, maybe this point deserves special emphasis because of the residual temptation to second the chorus of well-meaning non-specialists and laypersons, like Ulrich Beck in this case, who seek to enlist art in the great cause. That gets reinforced by the temptation in present context to extract from texts and images or map them onto paradigms of environmental value. In such a venue, one can't help but feel sheepishly untoward or uncollegial, not offering up Thoreau as, say, a prophet of deep ecology, or certain novels by Thomas Hardy as harbingers of bioregionalism, or Upton Sinclair as a forerunner of the environmental justice movement, as indeed they all are. Yet it's the suggestiveness and intricacy with which such dispositions are engaged, rather than any decisive commitment to them, that will keep an active environmental imagination alive long-lastingly. Likewise, eco-criticism's own staying power and percolation effect, certainly within the academy, and I suspect beyond it in the long run too, will depend on its ability to move beyond the usual suspects in what I like to call the enclave canon of environmental writing, from Thoreau to Mary Austin to Gary Snyder and Barry Lopez, to demonstrate the pervasiveness of environmentality as a major constitutive element in world literature from the start. And this is only going to happen when more of us do a better job of talking about how art and literature scripts environmental ethical concern, not as if it could be translated cleanly into the terms of some prevailing ethical or political discourse, but as thought experiment. In exploratory, often tentative ways that are complicated by multiple agendas, wavering of attention, refusal to take fixed positions. I've discussed elsewhere more pointedly my own preferred method for doing this, which involves situating text within an interdisciplinary matrix that draws eclectically on phenomenology of perception, intellectual history, humanistic geography, science studies, genre theory, and a post-Raymond Williams-ish brand of cultural/ideological criticism. But the payoff always lies in what you could say about text, how any such apparatus can help disclose the intimations of environmentality, if I can rip off Wordsworth, in individual text, their horizons of perception and implication, how they adumbrate, refract, and further environmental commitments or ideologies of whatever sort. So now to instantiate in my waning moments with a passage from what I hope for most of you will be a familiar text, Melville's Moby Dick. At least you know the story, right? Passage takes off from the question of why, or so it claims, whale meat seems unappetizing to most palates, even whalemen's, proposing that the key reason is not the obvious one, namely that it's unctuous and fatty, but a sense of taboo. This is an almost never discussed passage, but so such fun to do it. That a man should eat a newly murdered thing of the sea and eat it by its own light. That's the taboo violation, referring here to whale oil as the lamplighting fuel of preference. But no doubt, the first man that ever murdered an ox was regarded as a murderer. Perhaps he was hung. And if he had been put on his trial by oxen, he certainly would have been. And he certainly deserved it, if any murderer does. Go to the meat market of a Saturday night and see the crowds of live bipeds staring up at the long rows of dead quadrupeds. Does not that sight take a tooth out of the cannibal's jaw? Cannibals! Who is not a cannibal? I tell you that it will be more tolerable for the Fiji that salted down a lean missionary in his cellar against the coming famine. It will be more tolerable for that provident Fiji, I say, in the day of judgment than for thee, civilized and enlightened gourmand, who nailest geese to the ground and feastest on their bloated livers in thy pâté de foie gras. Well, this passage is trying to unsettle standard thinking about two conventional but arbitrary borderlines, both by questioning each in turn and crunching the two queries together. It's both a pre-Darwinian interrogation of species borderlines, are humans so different from whales and other non-humans, as they like to think, and a pre-Boasian questioning of what, if anything, differentiates so-called civilization from so-called savagery. The insinuation is that carnivorousness among, quote, civilized cultures that battens on beef and goose liver is cannibalism in denial, and as such arguably worse than the practices that so-called civilization stigmatize as taboo in their, quote, savage others. What's much less clear is whether a serious ethical position is actually being staked out and defended here. The passage is a manic, anti-orthodox Christianity riff that hovers between preachment and Rabelasian grotesquerie. The question of how seriously to take the assault on borderlines is further beclouded by the fact that the text speaks through the mask of a stand-in, the mentally hyperactive serio-comic narrator Ishmael, who's not one-to-one equatable to the author, clearly. On the other hand, sorties of this kind, once taken and reiterated, are bound to get picked up sooner or later by those who listen. Hence, cetacean biologist Roger Payne's praise for Melville's uncanny sense of his words, just how and by what steps whales enter our minds and how, once inside, they would metastasize throughout the whole engine of human ingenuity, mastering and predisposing it to their purpose. What he has in mind here, I think, are the many moments when the novel steps aside from its search and get destroyed plot to muse across the species borderline about cetacean intelligence, cetacean anatomy in relation to the human, so as to produce a long series of ad hoc exercises in comparative ethology that make it impossible not to think, if only one listens, about whales as fellow creatures rather than bestial or symbolic foes. Musings on how it might feel to lack binocular vision, to breathe only 1/7 of your existence, to have the sense of touch concentrated in a single organ, the tail, to exist in a body that seems skinless from a human perspective, yet adaptable to extremes of heat and cold, and so forth. By no means every reader will prefer to read this novel like Roger Payne or Larry Buell. Precisely because passages like those I quoted and noted are asides, it's quite possible to skid by them, and so it's been for almost the whole century and a half since Moby Dick's publication, both the nearly 75 years during which it fell into obscurity and the sesquicentennium since, during which, as one waggish fellow critic remarks, Moby Dick hermeneutics has superseded whaling as one of New England's leading industries. Most card-carrying Melvillians prefer to read the novel as a revenge tragedy, as an epistemological meditation or other sort of religio-philosophical inquiry, or as a political or economic allegory of some kind. Which, of course, is where environmental criticism comes in. By teasing out the landmark significance of the fact that this is the first classic of Anglophone literature to center on a non-human critter, to insinuate again and again the porousness of the species borderline between cetacean and human, and to speculate about the ethical import of that. But this line of reflection stands to make a permanent enhancement or redirection of readerly thinking only on condition that it conceives of the novel's incipient biocentrism as being in the nature of a thought experiment across species lines, a question raising about speciesism and coordinately ethnocentrism. rather than as unfolding a crystallized or consistent environmental ethics. And furthermore, that this line of reflection is neither the only nor the most ostensibly central dimension of the text. It ought to be considered breakthrough enough to change the conversation to the point that it becomes harder and harder not to notice the environmental thought experiment that's in play. And this, I take it, is where the epicenter of eco-critical work today ought to be. The rereading of the corpus of world literature from Gilgamesh to Beowulf on down, as raising, without systematically adjudicating, big basic questions about environmental values that no scholar, indeed no attentive reader, period, can ever again afford to ignore. If and when that happens, the very big claim made by Roger Payne for the force with which Moby Dick dramatizes the mesmeric power that whales exert over human minds and souls may actually start to hold for the power of environmental ethics, too, across the board. And this is quoting Payne, that they will reintegrate at the point of origin of all the meridians of the imagination, its very pole, and there tie themselves forever into human consciousness by a kind of zenith knot. Well, if enough key people do indeed get knotted up in such a way as this, maybe we shall be able to save the world after all, rather than sink like Captain Ahab. Thank you. I'm tremendously proud of myself that by my watch, at least, I only ran 2 minutes over. Don't believe that clock. I would be very glad to take any questions, comments, position statements. I made one. You two should feel free. Chastisements also. And I'll be devastated if nobody has anything to say whatsoever. I know coffee may not have yet kicked in. Who would like to intervene? Yes. Oh, yes. Awkward technology.
Sorry. Yeah. I just was wondering, sat in on the first day of a class that Amitav Ghosh was teaching this semester.
Yes.
And one of the things he was talking about was how the American canon of like Thoreau and Walden, that you go out into wild places and nature somehow is separate from human places. And he was kind of offering a critique of that, saying that he thought that that literature should rewrite a new narrative of how humans are in relationship to nature. And I was just wondering if you've been in conversation with him or what you think of that.
Yeah, Amitav and I have a good working relation. I know him pretty well. We borrow from each other. I think he's right about the tendency of canonical literature and even more of canonical interpretation to locate the environment in the outback. This is a historical and ideological product whose roots can be traced. It has partly to do, but only partly to do, with the underdevelopment of this continent on first settler contact and the rapidity of the transformation. But clearly, that mentality of nature is over there needs to be gotten past in order for a mature, robust environmental ethics to make headway. I think actually, to speak about Moby Dick, you can see in this particular passage that I tried to unpack, I could only do it in mini form, a continual referencing back from the deck of the whale ship to what's happening in the home country. He doesn't want to allow the illusion, which elsewhere he does himself further. Melville doesn't want to allow a simple illusion that the whale space is simply that the whale ship space is simply other space, that it's simply out there that the thought and action of consequence is taking place. I'm glad you raised that. Yes, sir. And you have to have a microphone. Apparently, this is part of the protocol.
They're fast. I'd like to open the question of the role of animal communication. You may know there's this growing group of people who claim to be able to intuit animal feelings and put them in words, and they do it beautifully, and it seems like literature. But I wonder, what would you say? Is this literature, human literature, or are we daring to think we can cross species boundaries? And finally, is this an ontological move that we need to pursue?
If by language you mean communication systems of whatever sort, as with cetacean through the amazingly long-distance sonar or whatever capacities they have, that Roger Payne talks about it in one of his books, actually. Where do you draw the line between how much uniqueness do you attribute to Homo sapiens with regard to language capacity? I think a primate study has shown that you can't draw that line as firmly as was once alleged. Then what about taking a more inclusive view of signifying practices, communication amongst creatures that aren't language of the kind that I've been using? I don't think that line can be drawn with complete clarity either. So we're into an area that actually Melville himself does not much explore. The examples I gave are strategic. He has less to say about whales communicating with each other in anything like language. But if he'd been around today, he would have included that in his diagnosis too. So this is a frontier that makes further problematic the old notions of species borderline and Homo sapiens exceptionalism. Now, how far we go in that direction, I'll leave it to this group to decide. I'm not an expert.
I don't think I need a microphone. Can you all hear me? This is a follow-up question, Larry.
Yeah.
If related to this is to the degree that we might push this in another direction. Do we anthropomorphize non-human species? And is this a good or a bad thing in terms of debates between anthropocentric and biocentric? Or is I don't know if you want to.
Yeah, I've addressed this in my book, Environmental Imagination. Clearly, there's a kind of human-centric false consciousness, if I may pilfer from Marxist language, to personifying the non-human. I think that if this is done with self-awareness, positive side, is a perhaps necessary bridge for dramatizing the claims of other life forms on us and the kinship thereof. It's a slippery slope or a risky thing to do, and it can be done in a schlocky way, an uncritical way, or it can be done in a more calibrated way. I see it as potentially an important part of the arsenal of the arts of environmental representation myself. So I'm a glass half full person on this one rather than a glass half empty one. But one common parlor game among a subspecies of eco-critics is to call out this or that writer, this or that text for anthropomorphizing. Yet chances are that if the author is worth his salt or her salt, he's guarded against that. The young Rachel Carson is an interesting case of advancing in a certain direction or falling off in a certain direction, depending upon your persuasion, towards anthropomorphizing the bestiary of creatures that she focuses on in Under the Sea Wind. There's Anguilla the eel, Scomber the mackerel, and so forth. It begins to sound kind of cutesy and belonging to the nursery rather than to the category of adult lit. But it's also a good model text to use to see how carefully she contains that rhetorical maneuver, even while trying to capitalize on it. There's a very interesting line of inquiry done, limited in scope, but it's part of the arsenal of the arts of environmental imagination, I think, even though all our weapons, arsenal, what a horrible metaphor, even though all our tools in the repertoire, tools is a little more neutral, they're double-edged. Yes, sir. Michael.
Excuse me. If you could please use the microphone so that the overflow room can hear the question. Thank you.
You get the overflow people in here. It's not as if we lack for chairs.
I wanted to, well, first, thanks. I really enjoyed your paper, and as usual, learned a lot just in those few minutes. I want to ask you this question, because then I wanted to talk about it later today, but it relates to this, and that is, if you think about somebody like Aldo Leopold, who in the Sand County Almanac spent a lot of time in these sketches of little mammals and other life forms on the land, living in the land, as it were, could be accused of anthropomorphizing in some sense, but nevertheless was engaged in a process of showing that these animals have a life of their own and are living a life for themselves. They're not merely objects. And yet he was also a hunter, an avid hunter, in fact. And that's because he was playing the role of top predator, because the wolves and cougars were gone and the coyotes. But one of the big debates in this area, as you know, is between animal rights people who emphasize the sentience of individual animals and the environmentalists who typically emphasize the species and say that what really counts is propagation of the species, not the fate of individual organisms. And this seems to me to be a continual source of tension between these two important contemporary movements, animal rights on the one hand versus environmentalism on the other. And what you're talking about is something that is an in-between. It shows the complexity of the issues involved here. And I wondered if you would address that.
Wow. As always with you, Michael, the thinking is complex. And in soundbite form, I shan't be able to address the whole menu. But here are a few points along the way of your comment. Leopold pursues a very interesting strategy in Sand County Almanac with regard to anthropomorphizing, I think. That's the first thing I want to say. He's very careful all along to emphasize the distance between his mental life world and the Umwelten of the critters that he's studying. I wonder what it's like to be a such and such is a repeated motif there. So that's just one thing that relates to Don's question too. Hunting. Historically, sport hunters have to be credited with some contribution to the rise of environmental consciousness for somewhat corporately self-interested reasons, as well as for the sheer love of the wild and the wish to preserve it. Of course, they have an interest in preserving game under conditions that makes hunting still feel properly primitive. Leopold, as you know, evolves during his life, and in Sand County Almanac, Thinking Like a Mountain is the chapter that muses about that, away from hunting. And in that text, Sand County, he never kills anything. In the illustrations that went with the text, there is one of a partridge in a hunter's jacket pocket, but that's not in the text itself. In the text itself, Smoky Gold, that chapter, he gets so distracted with the beauty of the fall that hunting never takes place. But it's still scripted in there. And it's only when he comes back in the last part of the text to talk about the shift from frontier consciousness, where hunting is normative, to today when sport hunting should be replaced by nature study, the wilderness aesthetic, that you see that he's trying to think about hunting as a sort of stage from which one evolves as culture and also landscape ecology changes. Now, as to the question of individual versus species, which is another, but this is the last thing I'm going to comment on in your set of comments, but it doesn't exhaust the potential. Yes, you would find a characteristic fault line between those two persuasions in terms of how much importance is attached to the individual as opposed to the species. Leopold himself is a species person, I think, except when talking about pets. Others of you may wish to correct me on this, but that's my perception. I guess that I don't want to take a position on whether I think that concern for the individual life form is one of those homocentric projections onto the natural world that we should resist. Because after all, how does it kick in? It kicks in with our domestic pets, first and foremost. Or whether it's a healthy calibration that would help in more humane, more eco-sensitive, ethical and policy steps with regard to our treatment of the natural world. I'd like to leave that open. I don't have my mind completely made up about that, whether it's a stumbling block or an enabler. I'm going to recognize audience people, if I may. Jim? And then two people there, both in turn.
To return to your opening statement, your position, Larry, it seems that there are some assumptions that might undergird it, and I wanted to state them and see if you agreed or would modify those assumptions. And that is that literature and the arts are, in a way, not disciplines in a genuine sense. They don't accumulate established bodies of knowledge and leave anachronistic knowledge behind. They're, as you yourself said, modes of representation. The old injunction for the arts was to imitate nature and to imitate human action, by which was meant not copy but select from those and then put together. So if that's true, then the arts would provide a kind of space which is not easily defined, not really disciplinary, in which acts of perception and imagination and representation are capable of coming together in a mix that they don't in other disciplines usually. And that provides a kind of nexus or interconnection which is extremely valuable for the discussion of those very areas of exploration where we can't just say, well, this is what we know and that's sufficient. So it brings in the question of belief and value and history. So just to give an example of a space, and this is from fiction, it's actually from science fiction. There was a man named Olaf Stapleton, who was a science fiction writer of many decades ago. And in the 1930s, he wrote a book called First Men and Last Men. And there are many pages in that book devoted to genetic engineering and what people will do with themselves and other creatures when they have the capacity, says Stapleton, to change the germplasm, which was his way of talking about what we now know much more about. So Stapleton's science is old, and he said this would happen thousands of years in the future, so he was wrong in his prediction. But when you go back and read those passages, almost all of the questions of value which we think about today with regard to GMOs and other things are right there in that piece of literature. Not fully formed, not ideologically hardened, but the questions are raised. And that would be an example of literature as a kind of space for these issues. Not a definite discipline, but an area of exploration.
What you say about Stapleton is very congruent with what I was trying to say about the Melville passage, and I take your comments there as a friendly furtherance. As to the very first things you said, Jim, we both know how risky it is to decline a rubric like discipline as applicable to our field. Immediately we turn to mush in the eyes of our colleagues, so it's intratribally suicidal. Nonetheless, it does point to, I think, something that's important about methodology, that the model for humanistic inquiry in general is much less the replicable experiment than the active interpretation. I think if we think about the disciplinarity that way and don't give any ground on the nomological point as to whether we're doing something disciplined, because that's what it seems to boil down to, then I think we're best off. One more, and I think then we have to stop. Maybe we shouldn't even do one more. One more. I promised. Yes.
I just have a quick question, and maybe it's hard to answer. I'm an environmental educator, and I wanted to refer back to your question. I feel that in a sense right now we're in a crisis in our redefining our relationship to the environment, to nature, to land. Historically, when we were a hunter-gatherer society, we had much of a greater connection. Then nature became a curiosity, and then nature became something that was romanticized, that you went off into it if you had the leisure time. And I travel the country working in schools where today now most ages of people I work with have no connection to land. And I think this is what is so pervasive in our political situation today, is that in fact there's a crisis in the definition of environmental education. It's gotten to have a very negative term, and the environment publicly is termed as something negative. And so we in the field are trying to redefine that term to not even use the word environment, but use the word ecology. So I feel that whereas all this academic discussion is critical, we're losing touch with a larger society that frankly doesn't even know what nature and ethics is anymore.
I was tempted to use as my exemplum an urban text rather than Moby Dick, which I happen to be teaching at the moment, and so I was sucked into the vortex irretrievably. And I commend that as a possible avenue for you, urban ecology. Take a look, just for openers, at Ann Whiston Spurn's book called The Granite Garden, which is about Boston as her chief test case for a take on nature within the city. And that's only the beginning of all that could be said about a kind of urban ecology focus for at least some student clienteles. And there's a body of literature and a visual creativity that can be made to go with that too. That may help. That may help.
Thank you very much.